So, stop me if this sounds familiar. Two different teams of writers announced that they are both working on musical adaptations of the same source material, a jazz-age literary classic about love, lust, and a raucous party gone wrong. As both of them go through early development, the narrative in the press quickly links the two unrelated projects together in the minds of audiences. By sheer coincidence, both musicals end up performing around the same time in the spring, one on Broadway and one not, and both garner middling critical responses. One seems to be playing it more safe, framing its story as a romance without delving into the complexities of the setting, while the other aims for a more difficult, elegiac, dreamy atmosphere at the expense of cogent narrative. Does that sound like anything you've heard of before? Well, it can't be the Gatsby musicals, because at time of writing the Florence Welch one hasn't opened, so I can't say how elegiac it might be. Yes, as you may have noticed, the spring of 2024 has brought the theater world two separate musical adaptations of The Great Gatsby. One premiering at Paper Mill Playhouse last fall before opening on Broadway this month, and one currently scheduled to debut at American Repertory Theater in May. But, as I already implied, this is not the first time that two adaptations of the same source material have opened in close proximity to each other. 1939 brought us two adaptations of Gilbert and Sullivan, The Hot Mikado and The Swing Mikado, which ended up playing across the street from each other in New York. The late 1980s saw Maury Yeston and Arthur Kopit's planned musical adaptation of Gaston Leroux's The Phantom of the Opera get dropped by producers when Andrew Lloyd Webber's adaptation announced a Broadway transfer. And the 1973 Broadway season featured the extreme coincidence of three separate plays about Mary Todd Lincoln. But none of these cases of parallel inspiration have stuck in the minds of theater historians more than the situation I was actually alluding to before, the time Michael John LaChiusa and Andrew Lippa both created musicals based on the Wild Parties.
Welcome to my party, glad you like the dress. Welcome to my party, baby, where's the ice? Who here's up for action? Who here's new? Welcome to my party. Who the hell invited you?
The unlikelihood that two artists would simultaneously rediscover a little-known poem, create two separate musicals based on it, and then get them both produced by off-Broadway companies at almost the exact same time, that is the kind of rarity that only occurs once in a generation. And, seeing as we're now a full generation beyond it, and a familiar situation appears to be happening with Gatsby musicals, I figure it might be a good time to revisit this odd little moment in theater history. Now, I already made a video about the Wild Party musicals back in 2020, in which I focused entirely on the timeline of their creation and limited my direct comparisons on the content of either musical. As I'll discuss, the important thing here is not which musical is better, it's understanding how this situation even happened. How did these musicals develop in tandem with each other, and what do we do with them today? So, the first section of this video will be, in effect, a remake of that older video of mine, telling the story of the two musical adaptations of The Wild Party. Then, we'll jump forward to today, to discuss how the situation with the Gatsby musicals is in some ways similar, and in other ways entirely different. We start back at the beginning, with the publication of the poem that both Lippa and LaChiusa were inspired by, all the way back in 1994. Much of the press around the Wild Party musical centered on the unlikelihood that two musical theater writers would both rediscover a relatively obscure 70-year-old poem at the same time. And while it's true that the poem was first published in 1928, that's not the full story. Joseph Moncure March, an editor and contributor for The New Yorker, wrote The Wild Party over the course of the summer of 1926. The salacious content of the poem led to many rejections until finally being published in a limited run 2 years later. Despite frequently being banned, the poem began to build up a cult audience of readers, particularly after March's next poem, The Setup, was published later the same year to greater success. When the copyright on The Wild Party came up for renewal, March, who had moved on to a career in Hollywood and later the State Department, didn't file the paperwork to renew, and so the poem entered the public domain in 1956. A reprint was issued in 1968, featuring edits from March that were derided for censoring the original text. But from that point onward, the poem remained a cult hit, something that was casually recommended and passed from person to person, but not typically assigned in classes or anthologized. One person to find the poem was Art Spiegelman, a renowned author and illustrator, whose 1991 graphic novel Mouse had been a runaway success and a Pulitzer Prize Special Award recipient. Spiegelman found a first edition of The Wild Party by chance in a used bookstore in the 70s, initially drawn in by the 20s-style lettering on the spine. The poem's intoxicating combination of violent debauchery with a nursery rhyme-like structure pulled him in, and it remained in the back of his head. It wasn't until another chance encounter with the writer William S. Burroughs that Spiegelman realized the poem's wide reach. Burroughs remembered it as, quote, "the poem that made me want to be a writer." To bring the poem to the wider audience it had been denied in its time, Spiegelman put together an illustrated 60-page reprint of the original uncensored text. Writing in the introduction about the poem's continued relevance, Spiegelman said, "Maybe it's March's perfectly pitched tone of bewildered innocence curled into worldly cynicism that resonates so well with our 90s. March's lost generation saw civilization unglued by the war to end all wars. Our foundering generation has recently seen the end of history." This reprint, published in July 1994 by Pantheon Books, was the edition that both LaChiusa and Lippa read, which inspired their respective musicals. To briefly summarize the poem, The Wild Party concerns Queenie, a showgirl, and her lover Burrs, a vaudeville clown. The two throw the titular party to smooth over a domestic dispute between them, but tensions rise when Queenie's old friend Kate arrives with her new lover in tow, Mr. Black. Through a winding narrative with more than a dozen characters, Queenie and Black fall for each other before being confronted by Burrs in a tragic final chapter. The poem itself is mainly written in loose couplets. March allows for fluctuations in line length and metric stresses, giving the poem an off-kilter and uneven vibe, which suits the raucous content. The non-linear episodic structure evokes the timeless feel of the all-night, booze-soaked party. There's little attempt to moralize. The poem casts a harsh light on the grotesque lives of the party guests, willing to throw away everything for a single night of indulgence. Running about 10,000 words, the poem is novella length, about 1/5 the length of The Great Gatsby. As planned, the 1994 reissue effectively introduced the Wild Party into the mainstream for the first time, 17 years after Joseph Moncure March's death, and among the many people to pick up this edition, 2 of them were composers. Andrew Lippa was the first, finding the poem in the fall of 1995 during a search for works to musicalize. Adoring the writing, he began independently adapting the Wild Party in January 1996, though his initial plan of using March's words as lyrics quickly fell through. "I was gonna do it like Cats, I was gonna set the poem to music. I found out later that that wasn't going to work. The poem was almost exclusively third-person narrative, and I got weary of writing in the third person. I wanted to write, I feel, I am." Another composer, Michael John LaChiusa, had the poem recommended to him as potential source material sometime in 1996, though he didn't begin writing until April of 1997. That month, LaChiusa was offered a year-long residency at the Public Theater, following their previous stagings of his musicals First Lady Suite and The Petrified Prince. When artistic director George C. Wolfe commissioned a new musical and let LaChiusa select the source material, LaChiusa suggested March's poem. So, by April 1997, there were 2 musical theater composers separately working on adaptations of The Wild Party. But as neither had been officially announced, no one knew about the coincidence. The first public announcement came about 2 months later, in June 1997, when Andrew Lippa's Wild Party was selected for a workshop at the Eugene O'Neill Theater Center. It's unclear whether news of this adaptation got back to LaChiusa and Wolfe at the public, though Lippa's musical faded into the background following its summer 1997 workshop. LaChiusa continued his residency, while Lippa moved on to his next project, a long-planned revisal of You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown. It wasn't until a year later that more news broke, this time from the other project. The Public Theater announced that LaChiusa's Wild Party would debut off-Broadway in February 1999, with George C. Wolfe serving as both co-bookwriter and director. Now, a brief tangent about George C. Wolfe. An accomplished writer and director, Wolfe received critical acclaim in the late 1980s for his off-Broadway plays The Colored Museum and Spunk, before breaking through to the mainstream by directing the Broadway musical Jelly's Last Jam and the original productions of Tony Kushner's Angels in America duology. At the time of the Wild Party announcement, his last original musical had been a 1996 collaboration with choreographer Savion Glover, the hugely successful dance piece Bring in da Noise, Bring in da Funk. So, with both Wolfe and LaChiusa seen as artists to pay attention to in off-Broadway circles, the Wild Party became a highly anticipated part of the Public Theater's upcoming season. which led to bigger headlines in December 1998 when Lacusa's Wild Party was postponed to an indeterminate date in the future. The official reason given was the conflicting schedules of the still unannounced cast, though many speculated about the financial state of the public theater, following a revival of On the Town that had flopped on Broadway amid mixed reviews. In place of the production, the Public Theater still planned for a private workshop of Lacusa's script, in the expected February 1999 time slot. But 2 weeks before that workshop got underway, fellow off-Broadway company the Manhattan Theatre Club announced on February 1st that they would be hosting their own workshop in April of Andrew Lippa's Wild Party. This was no longer just two authors adapting the same poem. This was two off-Broadway companies both publicly announced to be developing musical adaptations of the same source material. While only the public had announced intention to bring their musical to a full production, both companies had a history of transferring their productions from off to on Broadway. And the workshop of Lippa's musical was already being financially supported by producers Kevin McCullum and Jeffrey Seller, who had transferred Rent to Broadway in 1996. The Public Theater workshop was held from February 15th to 26th, 1999. The cast included film and television actress Vanessa Williams in the role of Queenie, and Broadway mainstay Mandy Patinkin as Burrs. Also in the ensemble was living legend Eartha Kitt in the greatly expanded role of Dolores. Kitt's credits are too numerous to name here, so I'll just include 2 clips.
Your silver-tongued oratorio has convinced me, Batman. I hereby remit myself to your muscular custody.
What? A llama? He's supposed to be dead!
Yeah, weird.
2 months later, the Manhattan Theatre Club workshop of Lippa's musical ran from April 12th to May 21st, with a cast that included Marin Mazzie as Queenie. Then, 6 weeks later, on July 9th, 1999, news broke that Andrew Lippa's The Wild Party was scheduled for a world premiere at MTC. At this point, the Lacusa musical was still tentatively scheduled for a full production at some point with no dates set, and so anticipation began to officially build. If the Public Theater moved Lacusa's musical to their 1999-2000 season, it could potentially end up running at the same time. But with Lippa's musical set for a February 2000 debut, there was still a chance that Lacusa's could be set for the fall of 1999 and debut first. Could both musicals complete their off-Broadway runs, then transfer to Broadway and compete against each other at the Tony Awards in 2000? As it turns out, no, because just a month after MTC made their announcement, the public made theirs. Lacusa's The Wild Party was scheduled to begin previews just 1 month after Lippa's, but it would debut on Broadway, not at the public's off-Broadway venue. But still, the announcements confirmed the hopes of many. For 1 month, Lippa's musical would be running off-Broadway while Lacusa's was in previews on Broadway, just a 7-minute walk away. From a January 6th New York Times article, for the time being, both Wild Party teams are playing down the concurrence of the musicals as an insignificant coincidence. But when pressed, the producers concede that the timing is unfortunate. I would love it if it weren't there, but it's there, said Scott Rudin. But he added, you can't run your life by what somebody else is doing. Lynn Meadow, artistic director of MTC, mirrored the sentiment. The fact that someone else was drawn to it, certainly as a matter of interest, is fascinating, but that did not deter our interest or affect our decision. George C. Wolfe expressed disappointment at not premiering first, but believed Lacusa's musical had improved with an additional year of workshopping. He also cited another example of twinned works, 2 modern-set Romeo and Juliet adaptations that had opened within 2 weeks of each other on Broadway in 1957, Romanov and Juliet, and West Side Story. Both directors, Wolfe and Gabriel Barry, said they would not watch the opposing production, while both composers said they were too busy with their own process to think about the other. Mandy Patinkin, however, said in an interview, "I'm fascinated by it. I'd love to see the other one." And speaking of Mandy Patinkin, both he and Eartha Kitt were confirmed to be returning for Lacusa's musical, though Vanessa Williams, now pregnant, had stepped away. In her place, actress Toni Collette would be making her Broadway debut as Queenie, fresh off her Oscar-nominated turn in The Sixth Sense. Lippa's musical announced casting as well, Rent alumni Idina Menzel and Taye Diggs as Kate and Black, with Julia Murney and Brian Darcy James as Queenie and Burrs. While both productions remained cordial about the coincidence, with neither production attempting to frame themselves as in competition with the other, the press began to permanently link the two. Every single article in Playbill discussing either production included a paragraph about the other musical at the bottom. Articles discussing the two works in tandem were published by the New York Times and the New Yorker. And on the growing community of online message boards, theater fans traced every development of the two musicals in real time as they moved towards the end of the year. Rehearsals for Lippa's musical began on December 29, 1999, and previews began on January 25, 2000. Lacusa's musical began rehearsals 2 days later on January 27th. Finally, on February 24, 2000, nearly 3 years after its first public reading, Andrew Lippa's The Wild Party opened off-Broadway, the first of the two musicals to premiere. Lippa's version centers the action on what he calls the love quadrangle: Queenie, Burrs, Kate, and Black. The side characters, while featured, lack their own emotional arcs, and most disappear from the second act of the musical. March's poem is incorporated into some lyrics, though the last song to use them is midway through Act 1. All the rest is Lippa's work. Michael Gibson's orchestrations also bring a contemporary edge to the show, with an ever-present electric guitar. Critics drew parallels to the then-recent revivals of Chicago and Cabaret, both of which applied a similar aesthetic of grimy realism mixed with a vaudevillian performance style. Many of Lippa's additions provide greater emotional vulnerability for the leads, mostly absent from March's original poem. All of Queenie's solos, as well as the two provided for Burrs, dramatize moments absent from the source material.
How many years have passed me by, wishing, waiting?
You wanna save my soul, but when I'm on a roll, lay off of the brakes.
The adjustments helped audiences to sympathize with the leads, but removed much of the bitter flavor that made The Wild Party distinctive on the page. Theater critic Ben Brantley wrote in his review, "This conversion of Queenie from ice blonde manipulator to little girl lost points to where the show as a whole breaks down, in its attempt to wring emotional sincerity from March's arched eyebrow of a poem." While audience response was more positive, the lukewarm critical reception led the producers to announce, 5 days after opening, that Lippa's The Wild Party would not transfer to Broadway. Lacusa and Wolf's The Wild Party began previews on March 10th, the beginning of the 30-day window when the two musicals were playing simultaneously in New York. This strange convergence ended on April 9th when Lippa's musical closed, and just 4 days later, on April 13th, Michael John Lacusa's The Wild Party opened at the Virginia Theater on Broadway. Unlike Lippa's focus on 4 characters out of a cast of 19, Lacusa aims to give all 15 of his characters distinct narratives and arcs. While Queenie and Burr's relationship frames the proceedings, the middle of the musical eschews linear narrative, jumping from person to person over an episodic, intermissionless 2-hour evening. The book and lyrics also aim at tackling more complex topics, alluded to in the poem but never addressed outright. These include socioeconomic disparity, sexual assault, racial identity, body dysmorphia, and more. Lacusa cited a single line from the poem as his major inspiration: "Her face was a tinted mask of snow." To this end, Queenie perpetually wears a thick coating of white makeup on her face, only to be symbolically removed at the very end. Burrs also spends part of the evening in makeup, as this production interprets clown as blackface minstrel. Reviews for Lacusa's The Wild Party were mixed to negative. Praise came in for Patinkin and Kit, and some praised the script that seemed more ambitious than Lippa's comparatively standard book musical. But audiences and critics alike agreed that the end result was too muddled to recommend. Despite dour reviews and average attendance around 50%, the producers were encouraged to keep Lacusa's musical running after it netted 7 Tony nominations, including Best Musical and acting noms for Colette, Patinkin, and Kit. At the 54th Tony Awards, the production won 0 trophies, and subsequently closed 1 week later on June 11th. In the wake of both productions closing, many critics wrote reviews directly comparing the two. In Shane Vogel's dual review for Theater Journal in March 2001, he criticized both musicals equally. The Lippa version for boiling down the complexity of the poem to a simple love story, and the Lacusa version for overcomplicating the story and failing to resolve many of its narrative threads. Vogel's final paragraph neatly summarizes the shortcomings that both adaptations share. Presenting material in a new medium can generate new interpretations or insights, but the variations MTC and the public theater made to March's original offered nothing interesting, contemplative, or provocative. Neither employed the possibilities of musical theater to produce new or alternative understandings of March's poem. Ben Brantley neatly summed up the differences in his review of the Lacusa production. If Lippa's Wild Party seemed to be a party with no personalities, Lacusa's Wild Party feels like a parade of personalities in search of a missing party. The shows are equally effective at guaranteeing that a good time is had by no one. To the question, then, of what happened with the two Wild Party musicals, The answer is pretty straightforward. Because both musicals developed at the same time, they did so in total isolation from each other. Neither adaptation could look to the other to figure out what had already worked on stage, and on the flip side, neither could look to the other to see what hadn't worked and avoid it. As such, the resulting pair of musicals are about as different as two works based on the same source material can be. The tone, the style, the pace, the moral, the sound, the size, the intent. You could argue that all they truly share is some character names and the title. In the end, for all the framing in the media about the two musicals competing against each other, I don't think it's possible to say that either adaptation won this battle. Despite sharing a source material, the resulting two musicals fit into completely separate niches within the modern musical theater canon: complex, morally gray chamber operas, and beautifully tragic modern rock musicals. In comparing the two, we are effectively comparing apples and oranges. The only reason we're even doing so is that they somehow came from the same tree. In the years since, both musicals have had a smattering of amateur and regional productions, though only the Lipa musical got a high-profile concert revival in New York. A 2015 run at City Center Encore's Off-Center, starring Sutton Foster and Stephen Pasquale as Queenie and Burrs. Overall, the Lipa musical remains the more frequently produced of the pair, though that's not necessarily proof that it's the better one. Comparatively, Lipa's musical is easier to produce in almost every aspect: simpler set, simpler score, simpler theming, simpler casting requirements. To be clear, Lipa's musical is not devoid of social commentary, but it's a lot lighter and easier to parse than Lacusa's, which arguably has more social commentary than plot. Lacusa and Wolfe wrote a 15-actor ensemble drama about how race, class, and social status affect our ability to live the lives we want to. Lipa wrote a tragic romance about four people in love with the wrong person. And this is why I don't love the discourse around which musical is better. It forces us to choose when really we should be upholding both. Not because they're perfect. Clearly, both are very imperfect. But to ask which one is better is to imply that there is one correct way to adapt the Wild Party. Recall the maxim from my Cat in the Hat video: fidelity to the source material is not the measure of quality for any adaptation. In adapting the same poem, Lacusa and Lipa were not aiming for the same target. Both had their own goals, and the resulting two musicals reflect their own understandings of March's poem. Neither the same, and both artistically valid. Which is probably a good place to jump forward about 20 years, because this phenomenon of two adaptations aiming for wildly different targets appears to be repeating itself. I'm not going to recap the plot of F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, nor am I going to dig too deep into comparing the craft of these two musicals. I have seen neither, and one of them hasn't even debuted yet. But I will be discussing their content in the broadest possible terms. And thankfully, unlike the Wild Party musicals, they don't have the exact same title. First up is The Great Gatsby, with a book by Kate Kerrigan, music by Jason Howland, and lyrics by Nathan Tyson. It premiered last fall at Paper Mill Playhouse before starting previews on Broadway this past month. If I time the production of this video correctly, it should be officially opening on Broadway the day this video releases. Directed by Mark Bruni, the production stars Jeremy Jordan as Jay Gatsby and Eva Noblezada as Daisy. Next up is Gatsby: An American Myth, with a book by Martina Mayok, music by Florence Welch and Thomas Bartlett, and lyrics by Welch. It is scheduled to premiere at American Repertory Theater next month, before an expected Broadway transfer sometime in the 2024-25 season. It will be directed by Rachel Chavkin and has already announced Isaac Powell and Charlotte McGuinness as their Gatsby and Daisy. For the sake of simplicity, I'll be referring to the first as Broadway Gatsby and the second as Myth Gatsby. I know that the second will likely go to New York too, but for now, it's Myth Gatsby. One of the immediate similarities between the Wild Party and Gatsby situations is the reason that two musical adaptations even can happen at the same time. Both source materials are in the public domain. Without copyright protection, writers did not have to appeal to the estates of Joseph Moncure March and F. Scott Fitzgerald for permission to adapt the stories, estates that likely would have only allowed one musical to proceed. With no copyright, there's no limit on how many adaptations can occur simultaneously. But what's most relevant to the situation today is timing. As mentioned, March let the Wild Party lapse into the public domain in 1956, where it sat mostly unadapted until Spiegelman's reissue in 1994. Fun fact, if the copyright had been renewed, the original poem would have entered into the public domain this year. By comparison, The Great Gatsby only entered the public domain in January 2021, And, being a very famous novel that was suddenly free to use in whatever way you wanted, there was an avalanche of Gatsby adaptations in the immediate aftermath. New novels like Nick or The Chosen and the Beautiful, graphic novelizations, DGEN's planned animated film adaptation, the American transfer of a long-running immersive Gatsby set in a hotel lobby, the fanfiction that replaced every instance of the name Gatsby with Gritty. Suddenly, everyone was working on adaptations at the same time. This is a major difference. For The Wild Party, the reissue certainly brought the poem to a new generation, but for most audiences it remained unknown. The Great Gatsby, however, evolved overnight from being a hugely famous novel to being a hugely famous and now copyright-free novel. So, honestly, it was only a matter of time before someone decided to make it into a musical. And by a matter of time, I mean 4 months, which is the amount of time between the copyright expiration and the announcement of Myth Gatsby's creative team. It's honestly surprising that it hadn't happened before. Yes, there have technically been Gatsby musicals before this, but never one that was on Broadway. This speaks to the adage I keep returning to on this channel, enormously relevant here. All theater is marketing, all marketing is theater. See, as much as LaChiusa and Lippa may have tried to play down the coincidence, anyone in 1999 could have told you that being one of the 2 Wild Parties was the best free publicity a new musical could hope for. Remember, March's original poem was mostly forgotten, so neither LaChiusa or Lippa could have relied on audiences or producers already knowing this source material. They weren't adapting the poem because it was famous, they were doing so because the material spoke to them, and they felt that they could make it work in their medium. This stands in stark contrast to the Gatsby musicals. Not only could both rely on audience knowledge of the famous intellectual property they were adapting, but in the case of Broadway Gatsby specifically, the initial impetus to create it didn't come from the writers, it came from a producer.
First ever conversation about this musical was in the lobby of the Intercontinental Hotel in Korea. With Mr. Shin, I had just worked on, he was developing an adaptation of Captain Nemo. We had done a reading of that and we were sitting in the lobby and he said, I want to talk to you about a project. This is my favorite book. I want to talk to you about doing it, and I really want to do this in Korea. And that's where it started.
And Mr. Shin is like, I don't know, like the Cameron McIntosh of
Big
Korea.
Producer in Korea. Big producer in Korea. Tons of hit shows.
This origin story puts Broadway Gatsby into a similar category of musicals alongside Legally Blonde, The Addams Family, or Mrs. Doubtfire. Musicals that originated from a producer hiring writers to craft a musical version of an extant IP, rather than the writers developing the adaptation on their own. And to be clear, this is not a value judgment. A musical does not have to spring forth from a creator's mind pure of all market forces to be artistically worthy. I like Legally Blonde and Addams Family, and I like Jason Howland's first Broadway credit, Little Women, a process in which Howland and lyricist Mindy Dickstein were brought in by producers partway through the process to replace a different writing team. That could be its own video, not getting into it here. And while I can't explicitly confirm that the team for Myth Gatsby was also assembled by producers, there are some hints that lead me to speculate that it was. An early article mentions Florence Welch being tapped to write for it. Welch's early statement says that she is honored to be offered the chance to adapt the story, and there is the practical quirk of the project being announced so soon after the copyright expired, but not premiering for another 3 years. Let's just leave it as origin undetermined for now. But, back in 1999, not only did the idea for both Wild Party musicals provably originate from their composers, they also could not have originated from anywhere else. If a producer goes to the trouble of contracting a creative team to build a new musical, they're doing so because they think it can be sold to audiences. No producer in the 90s would have put all their time, money, and resources into commissioning a musical based on a 70-year-old poem that a general audience had never heard of. That kind of idea only comes about because a writer really thinks it's a good idea. The Gatsby musicals exist, at least partially, because they were going to be really easy to market. The Wild Party musicals exist in spite of the fact that they were going to be very difficult to market. What really separates the Wild Party from the Great Gatsby is how the musicals were pitched to audiences. As mentioned, LaChiusa and George C. Wolfe were both tested artists and darlings of the downtown off-Broadway circles. Lippa was coming off the success of Charlie Brown on Broadway and had been known since the off-Broadway run of John and Jen in 1995. No matter what they were based on, either one of their next musicals was going to be an event not to miss. New work from a career worth following. The artists behind Broadway Gatsby certainly have successes to their names, only one is making their Broadway debut, but they have much less name recognition than either Lippa or LaChiusa had. Howland and Tyson's most recent project was being 2 of the 6 credited writers on Paradise Square, and Kate Kerrigan is best known for her writing partnership with Brie Loudermilk, who isn't involved in Broadway Gatsby at all. As such, the project isn't being pitched as part of the Howland canon or the next work from Kerrigan. It's being marketed as The Great Gatsby musical. Who wrote it? If the average audience member doesn't know them, it doesn't matter, but they know The Great Gatsby. With that said, it will be interesting to see how Myth Gatsby handles this marketing question. The individual artists are better known, and I could certainly see audiences attending on the grounds of, it's the woman from Florence and the Machine. But even so, the source material serves as a strong audience pull in its own right, in a manner that the Wild Party musicals never had. It's also worth pointing out one other considerable difference between the two coincidences. Despite ending up running in New York around the same time, neither of the Wild Party musicals was ever billed as a pre-Broadway run. Even though LaChiusa's musical ended up premiering on Broadway, its planned 1999 debut would have been off-Broadway, at the public, and Lippa's producers waited for reviews to come in before considering a Broadway transfer, and then, in the end, elected not to. Compare this with the Gatsbys, which both labeled themselves as pre-Broadway runs from the first time they were announced publicly. Though, to its credit, Broadway Gatsby was quietly planning to run in South Korea first, only debuting in America after Paper Mill artistic director Mark Hobie attended an early workshop and basically poached it.
We did another reading because nobody knew which way we were going to go.
Yes.
And then Mark Hobie, you invited Mark Hobie to that.
I invited Mark Hobie.
You invited Mark Hobie.
Yeah.
I mean, you both knew Mark Hobie. I didn't know Mark. We obviously love Mark Hobie. But I remember that the surprise of, well, Paper Mill wants to do this. Oh, I guess we're on this trajectory now.
Well, sure.
You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
It's instructive to consider how LaChiusa's The Wild Party had its debut postponed by 14 months when additional workshopping was needed, compared to Broadway Gatsby going from first announcement of its existence to Broadway opening night in about 16 months. Of course, I should close by acknowledging that even beyond their source material, and even now before Myth Gatsby has opened, it's clear that the pair do share one important similarity to the Wild Party situation. They are not aiming for the same target or the same audience. I'm far from the first commentator to recognize Broadway Gatsby as the Lippa of the two, a much more romantically focused, symbolism-light, classically structured musical. It says everything about the production that nearly all of the marketing images have focused on the romance between Gatsby and Daisy. Even just having the subtitle An American Myth implies to me that Myth Gatsby is going to have a more nuanced and critical take on the book. Also, sidebar, intentional or not, I appreciate that Myth Gatsby holding off its New York run until 2025 means it will likely be running on the 100th anniversary of the book's publication. That's reason enough to delay in my mind. This returns us to my statement from earlier about the true lesson of the Wild Party musicals. Don't feel the need to compare apples and oranges just because they came from the same tree. If LaChiusa and Lippa focus their adaptations on different aspects of March's poem, then that's fine, they're not the same. Similarly, there's no point in critiquing either Gatsby musical for not being close enough to the book, or in labeling one of them the good one. They're just different, and hopefully when they're licensed in the future, neither will replace the other. Like the Wild Parties, the Gatsby musicals can coexist in their respective niches. And if you write another musical adaptation of The Great Gatsby someday, it can exist in its own niche too. In the end, no source material should be considered dominated by a single adaptation. Regardless of whether someone got to it first, stories continue to be told because people choose to continue telling them. And for every work of jazz-age literature that's adapted into a stage musical, there's a whole world of source material still ripe for reinvention. Because, while it may be true that you can't repeat the past, you can at least adapt it to imagine a new future.